it's got a lifespan of 5 years before it's reviewed.
Yeah.
I've never held the view that this was static. This would always be amended in response to the conditions that prevailed at the time. So, to take your point, if the mood was to strengthen, then that would be certainly possible. If, and take the unlikely event, the mood was to go the other way, you could do it. But there were some who said we've done it now, it's set in stone. I've never believed that, because situations change, and I think that the capacity has got to be there to adjust it as circumstances develop, and as we become, as the science becomes better known, as a whole lot of things. So I wouldn't rule out it being strengthened.
Okay.
I think it's more likely than not, in fact.
Okay, so we'll just go. Oh, are you filming already?
Yeah.
That's all good. We'll just go through these.
Yep.
So, do you view the transition to a low carbon economy as an important area of investment to New Zealand?
Yeah, I think it is, and it's not just to New Zealand, it's to the world. But I think that one of the sort of the developments that's flowing from this, and you're starting to see it now in business, is that low carbon, green based technologies are not just becoming a nice thing to have, but almost a requirement. People are looking at industries and saying, well, we're not trading with you if you don't have these sorts of technologies in place. So I just think it's just the pressure is overwhelming and inevitable, and there's no other way.
So how should our government promote the research, development and deployment of new green technologies and sustainable practices to Kiwi businesses?
Well, I think that generally speaking, we've got to do much more in the area of promoting research and development, full stop. I think that's been one of the areas where I've been disappointed that the government hasn't done as well as I think it could have done. And certainly within that, new technology becomes vitally important, not just from a sort of a clean green point of view, but also from the perspective of the efficiencies that it might bring. I think that one of the things that people try and trade off here is they say, well, if you do that, it's automatically inefficient. I don't think that's necessarily the case. There are some cases where it will be, but I think you've got to work to having effectively good environmental decisions being good economic decisions. That's always been a mantra, but it's never quite been delivered. So I see that as part of ongoing research and development promotion, this has got to be a critical part of it. I think it's the sort of thing we've got to do through the Global Alliance as well.
And do you think that green jobs have a role in reducing New Zealand's unemployment problems?
Yes, I do, although the only qualification I would enter is really similar to the point I made before. I think they've got to be real, they've got to be sustainable. They can't just be sort of done because they've got that tag to them, because I don't think they do in that, they don't make any great contribution in that sense. But if they are real jobs, if they are cutting edge, sustainable and are part of the change, absolutely.
In your opinion, is the ETS an equitable system which delivers the right economic signals and incentives?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's not perfect, it never will be, but I think it's better than the alternatives. And I think the issue then becomes one of the entry points of various sectors into the system. And I think once the process is completed and you've got it operating relatively evenly across all sectors, that's when it's truly worth is arrived at. I accept at the moment, because we're still going through the various entry points, it's not quite like that. But I think ultimately that's where it ends.
So at the moment, do you believe that changes to the ETS are necessary to make it more
I think it's inevitable it will be reviewed, both in the light of international experience and also in the light of what's happened here. And I think that was always intended to be the case. And as I said to you before, I would be horrified if we thought the thing was set in stone once and forever, never to be changed.
What are your opinions on expanding New Zealand's fossil fuel industries?
We've got to be careful here. On the one hand, there's a requirement and a need that needs to be met. On the other hand, there's an issue about, well, how far does that lock you into the sorts of things we're trying to prevent? So I think it's got to be a balance. I think that particularly with regard to oil, there's a lot of very careful work to be done there, and I just think this is a matter where you have to move very, very prudently, and I'm not really in any great hurry to do so.
So you wouldn't support a moratorium on new fossil fuel extraction or an ETS which price that out?
I'd be more interested in the latter than the former. I'm not ruling out supporting a moratorium, but I think that it needs to be in the proper context, and I think part of that context is getting the right pricing signal, and I think that's where an ETS type formula is probably best suited to give you that answer.
What do you see as the main future sources of energy for New Zealand?
Well, I think that's the other side of this question, and I think that's why I'm a little cautious about ruling out completely not a reliance on, but a use of fossil fuels, because I'm not sure we've done sufficiently well internationally, actually, in terms of the alternatives. I think that obviously electricity, I think we've got much more to do in the area of looking at tidal. Wind, I'm a wee bit sceptical about, because we're a windy country, but the problem is there are a lot of uneven effects that arise from that. Solar, I think there's more we need to be looking at. I think some of the hybrid technologies that are now being developed in the motor industry are worth further exploration. I'm not a mechanic, I don't understand the technicalities, but I do know that you've got vehicles that are now running highly efficiently on quite hybrid fuel schemes. I even think in a sort of a funny sort of way, if you go right back to wartime conditions when people were producing gas from beets and various other things, I'm not suggesting we go back to that, but I think there's a whole lot of innovative technology around there that we shouldn't just rule out looking at. How did the Germans, for instance, with access to no oil resources during World War II, manage to produce synthetic fuels in wartime conditions? Now, maybe a whole lot of reasons that we don't want to sort of go into, but what I'm saying is I think there's a lot of knowledge that's around that we need to delve into and see how it can be utilised in today's environments to produce environmentally safe outcomes.
Yeah. So you do feel that the government should be giving more support to renewable energy industries?
Yes, it should, and I think that the test here is actually one about, it's not economic and environmental sustainability, well it is ultimately, but it's also I think we've got to do much more to build political and human sustainability. I think one of the reasons people are not suspicious but a bit wary about renewable energy resources is, what's the impact going to be on me in the short term? Wind farms are a classic, leaving aside some of the other issues that they give rise to. But I think that sort of case for the alternatives has not been sufficiently strongly built. It's all in the category of it's a good thing to do. For instance, a couple of years ago, a rugby club in my electorate installed solar heating. Now, you might think, so what? It's the first sports club in New Zealand to have done so. And I was talking to the engineers, and they said, we've made this big investment in New Zealand in solar heating and panels for homes, which is good. But actually, if we'd invested a fraction of the same amount in buildings like this, in industry, major office blocks, the power savings are huge and much greater than we've done, and the investment is actually much less. So the point from that for me was there's a lot of smart stuff we're not doing. We're doing stuff that is good and noble and sort of has a not so much a feel-good factor to it, but it's got a worthy factor to it. But there's a whole lot of other stuff we aren't doing. Why aren't, I don't know about the university here, but I suspect it doesn't have solar heating. Why aren't we putting that in our hospitals? Why, and those big, heavy users of electricity. This sports club I went to, Wellington's topography is such that where that place is situated is often in sort of cloud. And he said that even cloudy weather, they can get water heated to 60 degrees from the panels. Now you think, hang on, if the technology is you're able to do that for a setting like a sports club, what could you do for a hospital or a factory, let alone a home? And I think we've got to do much more thinking about how we go to, where the big users are and how we give them the capacity to use electricity efficiently and effectively in a way that isn't drawing too heavily on non-renewables.
Do you support the reallocation of spending on new roads towards low carbon and public transport initiatives?
I don't think it's that simple, actually. I think that the blunt answer is you've got to do both. I think that there is a huge need for our highway infrastructure to be upgraded. I think public transport, particularly in the major cities in terms of alternatives such as rail, needs significant additional investment. I think other alternatives, whether they be, as you say, low energy use vehicles, ferries, a whole range of things, but I don't see it as an either or. And I think really what we're paying for now is probably 50 or 60 years of underinvestment. We built a lot of roads and highways in the 50s and stopped. We did a lot of, our rail system fundamentally has not been upgraded since the end of World War II. And I think there are a lot of things like that we're now actually paying the price for. and those dollars are dear. So people then say, "Oh, you got to make some choices. You got to cut back here, not do this, not do that." All I think that does is condemn us to a similar fate 40, 50 years down the track.
How do you feel that your electorate can best reduce its emissions as a community?
Well, we're an interesting one because we are largely a residential commuter belt, I guess. We have few centres of large employment, but I think the sorts of activities I'd want to see people engage in is much more awareness about not so much per capita reduction, but a much more efficient use of energy. And I think sometimes we confuse the two, and I think that goes back to the point I was raising before about the lack of public buy-in. People see they've got to turn things off, as opposed to how do you actually use what energy we have more efficiently. I think that's where I'd like to see the debate shift. And I think that comes down to a lot of things in the home environment, little things like just making sure you turn things off when you leave in the morning, that you don't leave computers running excessively. There's a whole lot of practical things. There's also how you derive your heating, and I think just more awareness and wisdom about what the issue is and what every little step you take makes. I mean, this is not so much, it is broadly energy related, but the amount of water that people waste cleaning their teeth if they leave the tap running while they do so, it's quite frightening. There's litres that you go down the drain. Now, if you take that analogy and think about the amount of power you waste when you're in a room that's got the light left on and you're not there, or when you leave the TV on the remote, I think ECA's doing a really good job in terms of efficiency, but I think there are things around those practical steps that you can give people guidance on that we need to do much more on.
Okay, final question. Do you think that New Zealand's current position on climate change is acceptable?
To the public of New Zealand, I suspect they would see it as being okay for the time being, but obviously not a position to sort of rest on our laurels on for the future. In the international context, it probably is, given where others are. Having said that, my view very strongly is that this is a dynamic and ongoing thing. We've got to respond to emerging situations, both in terms of international developments, but also in terms of as the knowledge becomes clearer, as the impacts become clearer, what the solutions we need to be adopting should be.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks very much for agreeing to see us.